All right. Well, everyone, thanks for coming to the PHP Meetup group. If you're not familiar with what we're doing this 200 days of coding. And in this project, in the advanced group, we have this particular book. Every speaker is covering 2 chapters. So does anyone have this book? Or familiar with this book? OK, great. So in terms of this book, I have to admit, I flipped through it. And I thought it was well-structured. It made sense. But the presentation tonight is more about ideas and concepts and understanding than verbatim going through the examples in the book. Also, I want to encourage people at any point in the presentation to come with a question, a correction, an opinion. This could be a little bit of a dialogue, if you will. So my name is Ryan Mahoney. I'm a senior software engineer at BetterLesson. BetterLesson is hiring, so you know. We're in Cambridge. It's a startup. It's in the education space. And we have a very strong engineering team, let me tell you. So look us up. And if you're interested, talk to me after the presentation. I have about 15 years of experience in software development, database administration, and software architecture expertise. A lot of my experience is in PHP. And I think I've kind of benefited in the sense that when I was a very junior programmer, PHP was kind of a junior language. And as I learned new things, PHP itself really changed. When I started doing PHP, you couldn't do object-oriented PHP. There was no such thing, and now it's almost Java. So why is OOP important? So I think there's a lot of different reasons. The first reason is that it's universal, right? Whether you're doing PHP, Python, Ruby, whatever it is, the concepts behind object-oriented programming are the same. I like to think of it like, say you're into baseball, right? You're going to know how to hold the bat, how to put your elbows, how to position yourself. I think as a programmer, you have to know object-oriented programming. It's going to come in handy for so many things. It's a good system for creating modules. You can get the benefits of encapsulation. If you're not doing object-oriented, you're probably creating a lot of functions. All these functions and variables exist in the same space, and it is very, very easy to create some kind of collisions, whether that's in your own code or if you try to integrate someone else's code that also has all these variables and functions in the global space. You're very, very likely to have these collisions. Another kind of subtle thing is that there's a lot of mature sort of tooling. So for example, for testing your code, there's a lot of different frameworks that can test object-oriented code. For analyzing it, you have tools for that too. Has anyone here used Composer for PHP? So we have, OK, 3 or 4 people. Composer, I think, is really such an important part of PHP. And it's making PHP more modern and more flexible. You'll find that most of the packages that you can get through Composer that you can sort of compose into your own project, those projects are almost entirely object-oriented. And there's a reason. When you structure your code this way, it makes it easier to include into some random bit of someone else's code because it's self-contained, it's encapsulated, it's modular. Also, object-oriented coding is a kind of documentation on its own. Occasionally, I have to look at somebody else's code, some kind of framework, some kind of library, or whatever it is. And before I even read the code, I'll just kind of see the names of the classes that they created, right? Is it one class with 10,000 lines? Is it a group of MVC classes? You could learn a lot about how the person was thinking, what their ideas are, just by seeing, do we have 500 tiny classes? I mean, there's so many different things you can glean just by seeing what the names of the classes are.
Can you step away from the speaker, please?
Oh, I don't getting some feedback. OK, no problem. So this is like a super advanced topic would be software architecture design patterns, which we're not going to cover. I think there's speakers pretty much everywhere in this room. Is it like feedbacking? Is this OK, sir? How do you feel about this?
You need a microphone. I mean, it's just pretty small.
Just turn it off?
Try turning it on.
He's recording.
Yeah. Is it really bad?
That's good. It's not too bad.
OK. So software architecture design patterns are another kind of language for programmers. There's things like a singleton. Now, if I was working with one of my coworkers here and I said, oh, why don't we use a singleton? He would know what I'm talking about right away. But if we didn't have this pattern, I would have to spend like 20 minutes explaining, well, there's this kind of class, it's connected to this one, it's used in this way. So these patterns are super important for being like a productive, like a good communication sort of team. But they really sit on top of object-oriented ideas. So let's get into the theory of it. One thing about object-oriented that I really love is that there's really not that much to it. You have these 4 things. You have classes, which have fields and methods, and you have objects. Now, these things have different aspects, different qualities that we're going to get into, but at the end of the day, this is pretty much what we're working with in object-oriented programming. So let's define a class. To define a class in PHP, all PHP has to have this PHP opening tag here, class. You use this keyword class. You're going to give your class a name. Typically, this is not like a rule, but oftentimes you'll see that classes start with a capital letter, and the body of your class would be here. Although this class doesn't really have a body, this is a valid class in PHP. It just doesn't do anything, but it is a class. So classes, I was saying, they really consist of 2 types of things. The things that a class has are fields. In this class, we have a class called nice person that has a field called greeting. Greeting, in this case, has a default value of hi, and then it has a method. Now, this could be sort of confusing that methods aren't public method, say greeting, they're public function, say greeting, but that's how it is. They're really called methods in object-oriented programming, even though when you read them, it will say function every time. It's a type of function. And then here we have this, which we're going to get into, and we're referring to the greeting hi. If I make an instance of this class, I might say that Ryan is a new nice person, and he's going to say greeting, and my program's going to... Oh.
Is this an okay time?
Yeah, should we just take a break? Is that...
Yeah, maybe take
Yeah.
a couple minutes.
Sure.
People can eat.
Should we split?
So people are complaining about the mic that's attached to the speakers.
Oh,
saying
yeah?
that I don't need it and it's feedbacking or whatever.
Oh,
we
you
just
can turn that off.
Which one is that?
It's this one. Yeah,
There we go.
perfect.
Thank you. Yeah, I turned it off.
Okay, so tell me about BetterLesson.
Oh, sure, sure.
I build myself as like a applied mathematician. I've done a lot of algorithmic work. It's like done lots of C++, Sustain. So it's like this seems very similar to C++.
Oh, yeah, yeah. I mean, C++ is in like a family of programming languages that are structured like this. C++, Java, PHP,
Right.
even JavaScript to a degree are all
Right.
going to have these kind of things in common.
I'm going through a course on PHP and it's similar to C and C++.
Absolutely.
And it's like not hard. I mean, I just gotta
No.
get everything under my belt.
Exactly, exactly. I mean, I think the syntax and things like that you can pick up pretty quickly. It's more like, I think if you're learning, you have to kind of come up with some kind of challenges, like connecting to the database,
Yeah.
pulling information
Right.
out, making it easy for people to edit it,
Right.
things like that. But
That's why I'm going through a course. To get all through.
Cool.
But anyway, BetterLesson. So what's
oh yeah. So BetterLesson is a company that has a social mission. So at BetterLesson, we're really trying to make teachers into better teachers. So
Okay.
we have a few different things. We found that teachers spend a lot of their time creating lesson plans. So we made
Yeah,
a system
of
for
course.
teachers to share those lesson plans with each other, so that they can kind of like share what works.
by PDF or?
Yeah, I mean,
video
by
or-
video,
Oh, okay.
all sorts of different
Okay.
stuff. And then we found that there was like a certain subset of our like user-generated content that millions of people were downloading, but it was like a small percentage of our teachers. So then we created this project called the Master Teacher Project, where we found the best teachers across the whole country and had them create like even more improved and high-quality lessons with a lot of video and visual materials and things like that. those we have like 1 million teachers who have downloaded these lessons and used them in classrooms. And now we're at like sort of a third iteration of our product where we're working directly with schools to provide sort of like training, or not training, like coaching to their teachers, but like using the software that we created. So yeah, it's a really cool company.
How do they know it works?
That's a great question. So, I mean, there's a couple ways, right? So one way would be that like other teachers, like a lesson was popular, right? Many teachers downloaded it.
Right,
Teachers were
right.
commenting on it that, oh, you know, I did this lesson in my class, the kids loved it, this kind of thing. In our new product, though, we're defining like metrics so that we could sort of objectively say that kids before this type of lesson were at this level, after the lesson, we have this level, right? So it's tricky
A
to...
little evidence-based.
Yeah, exactly.
They do
exactly.
metrics as well?
Yeah,
Those are tricky.
yeah.
Those are
So
tricky.
that's like what we're getting into, and they're tricky to gather. They're tricky to quantify.
Yeah.
But
normalize.
it's exactly what you're saying. We want to make it kind of like an evidence-based learning type of
How long
thing.
have you guys been doing this for?
Well, I've only been in the company for about a month, but
Okay.
yeah. But they've been around for maybe like 4 years. They're in Cambridge. They're about like 4 years old, and I think there's about like 20-ish people in the company.
What kind of roles you?
We're looking at the moment for a person who's sort of like so-called like full stack-ish,
Full stack,
someone who
okay.
could do like front-end work, someone who could do back-end work, would do a lot of PHP, a lot of JavaScript, a little bit of Python. I think our team, it's not that we're like dedicated to a particular technology, but we try to have a team of people who's like really dedicated to like really excellent software practices and learning and things like that. So
Okay.
I mean, it's a great company, a good mission, but also it's like a good sort of like engineering team to like always be,
Right.
you know, learning and pushing yourself.
You guys
and
do Agile?
this kind of thing. Yes. But you know, I mean, everybody kind of talks about agile. Like, I wouldn't say that we're like
Scrum butt.
fundamentalist agile, but yeah, we
I
do
mean,
sort of.
startup it's tough because you gotta be running around. So.
Yeah, but you know, I did a lot of agency work, right? And in agency work, at the end of the day, the client is paying like a fixed price for something to be delivered on a particular time, right? So agency work is almost like inherently difficult to do in an agile way unless you convince your client that they need to get on board with this thing, right?
Right.
But since this is our own internal product, you know, we really could do it in a very agile way. You know, let's suppose that we get into a particular sprint and we find that, we want to really change some kind of component or whatever it is, and it's going to change the deadlines. Well, if it's going to make the product better, so be it,
If I was
you know?
I'd be like, hell yeah, let's do it.
Yeah,
You know?
yeah, exactly. So, so we do agile. Let me just grab a quick slice.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
But like, you know, hey, I want to sell it to like apartment buildings. I actually work with this gentleman right here, Colin, you know.
Great presentation so far, by the way.
Oh, good. I'm glad you
Very
like it.
articulate.
Excellent. Have a seat, grab a slice.
Design diagram like that, they can just like use show a class header or something. And tell you the purpose, like why.
So your metrics, you might need some algorithmic work or machine learning or anything like that? Or?
I don't think so.
No?
No, not so much for us. I know there's some like education startups that are trying to like automate the grading process of things
Okay.
like answers that are written, not like multiple choice, where I think there's like some innovation in terms of algorithms. But in terms of how we would do it, I think it's much simpler than that. I'm just trying to give you like an accurate picture of what it would be.
So you're looking for more software engineers? Than
Yeah, it's more about like building a system. It's about like the user experience, creating a process for these teachers and coaches that's like user-friendly and easy, which, you know, so visual design is a part of it, but really, like, for example, like our CTO, he's really interested in the speed of the system. He wants the pages to load very quickly because there's a lot of evidence that shows that, you know, pages that load fast, people pay, you know, they use it, they spend time on it, they don't leave. versus if it's slow, they're like, oh, they just lose interest, you know.
You have a card? I mean, actually look at the.
So, you know, I don't, but it's betterlesson.com, and my email will be in here. I wish I had a card, but I don't have one yet, so.
Okay,
Yeah.
so I'll take a look.
Yes, and what's your name?
Frank.
Frank, good to meet you.
Thank you.
Oh my gosh. Oh, so you're 16 with us.
Should we start back up? So I think we're going to keep moving with the presentation. Hey everyone, if you don't mind, if you could get your slice and head back to your seat, we're going to get started again. So I just came here from New York recently, and I'll tell you, this Boston pizza is not anywhere near as good as New York pizza. Just throwing that out there.
Have you been to New Haven?
New Haven? No, I had to have good pizza there.
You say that about New Haven.
All right, I'm gonna.
I'm from New York, and I think there's one place that has better pizza than New York.
What's it called? What's it called? Oh, Chicago. Chicago. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
Second city in general, but first in pizza.
So I turned my mic off because it seemed to be kind of annoying. Can everyone hear me all right? Are we good? Do we need the mic? No? What's that?
For the video.
Yeah, this one's for the video.
Oh, okay.
Got you covered. Okay. So as I was saying, that classes pretty much have two things in them. They have these fields and they have functions. We're going to get into detail on what those things are, but I just wanted to show a simple but complete example of defining a class, defining a field, defining a method, instantiating the class, and seeing the output. Creating an object. An object is an instance of a class. And I have to tell you this sort of funny story. I used to work for an agency in New York, and part of my responsibility was hiring people. And we'd try to hire senior people, six-figure salaries, and it was very, very hard to recruit and find and hire good people. And I think that the challenge of hiring a programmer is that programming is the thing that you do, right? And I'll use another sort of baseball analogy. You could know all the stats about baseball, all the history, all this kind of stuff. It doesn't mean that you could steal a base or hit a home run, right? So if you're trying to build an all-star team, you need people who can do it, right? And it's hard to, sit in a little room with someone and ask them some questions and figure out, can you do it, right? Or are you just like a fan? Do you just like to read Slashdot or, whatever it might be? So I was telling one of my coworkers, I have a set of questions that I ask people. And my favorite question to ask is, what is the difference between a class and an object, right? And so he's like, are you going to ask that question? Yeah, let's go. So we interviewed this guy, and he was great. He was from HBO. He was so charismatic and knowledgeable, and he worked on all the cool stuff, the interesting stuff. So I was like, kind of joking. I was like, there's this one question that I ask people, but you seem so smart. Maybe I shouldn't ask you. And he's like, no, ask me. And I go, what is the difference between a class and an object, right? And he's like, speechless. And he tries to be cool. He puts his hands up behind his head and he's thinking. I see these watermelon-sized stains in his armpits, right? And I was like, he's done. That's it, I mean, this is the basics of programming, right? If you don't know that an object is an instance of a class, what are you doing, right? So anyway, an object is an instance of a class. If you do show up to BetterLesson to have an interview, you will be asked this question. So let's think about this for a second. Consider that a house is an instance of a blueprint in sort of object-oriented thinking, right? Many houses can be made using the same one blueprint. A blueprint is useful as a description of a house, but you cannot live in one. An object takes up space, let's say memory, and can possibly store things like data and do things, be executed, be run. This basic analogy is sort of the fundamental concept behind really grasping that a class is like a description. It lays everything out, but the things start to happen when that class gets instantiated. It takes up memory and does all these kind of different things. So let's look at fields. Fields, the book calls them fields. I tend to call them class variables, but some people call them attributes or data members. Think of fields as sort of a storage place in a class or an object. Objects are going to need to do some kind of work. So we have this class called a form input field. Has everybody here worked with HTML forms before, for the most part? So we know that forms have different types of tags. Let's suppose that this class is going to be used for some sort of field objects for rendering fields. So let's look at how we might set some values. So in this particular class, we have this field called type. And I'm saying it's an input, input type text kind of thing. Actually, this should have been text. In any case, we have a constructor which, when this class is turned into an object, we can pass it certain values at that moment in time, and we can set some of the fields that way. We could create a method that could be called from the outside that takes in a value, and we can set that internal field that way, or depending on visibility, which is something we're going to talk about in a few minutes, from the outside we can sort of reach in and set an internal field value. So we can set a value by giving it a default value. We can set it at the moment that the class is turned into an object. We can sort of reach in if it happens to be a public field, which is kind of a bad practice, but it's possible to do. Or a method. Any method would have access to the internal fields of a class. Has anyone heard this quote? There's two hard things in programming. The only two hard things in computer science, cache invalidation and naming things. And naming things seems like a kind of trivial thing, but really how you name your fields, how you name your methods, how you name your class is like the very, very basic thing for someone else to look at it and be like, oh, okay, I see this is a form class and it has this kind of a method and it has these kind of fields. Okay, this kind of makes sense, versus calling something, oh, it's a manager. Oh, it's a manager? What is it? What does it manage? Or giving your classes like your methods like cryptic names or abbreviations that only you understand, things like that. Anyhow, methods similar to functions. Methods are where the logic of your class lives. I should have made this like a bonus question, but I was wondering when I was putting together this presentation, what's the difference between a function, if you're doing PHP just purely through functions, or a method? And really the difference is that a function only has access to the things that are passed into it, whereas a method has access to what's passed into it, but it also has access to the internal fields that have been predefined in that class. I'm seeing some people, some eyebrows shifting, but that's not such an important point. We'll see that as we go forward. So here's a more complete version of this class. So let's take this class apart piece by piece. We have a field called tag and a field called value. I've made them private, which we'll talk about in a little bit. There's a constructor. The constructor takes in 2 arguments. This is the signature of this method. It takes in a type and it takes in a value. Value could be, is not required. It will default to null. When these things are passed in through the constructor, this object will be initialized with whatever the values are that are passed in. This particular class, which is supposed to represent a single form field, has a render function. And when this render method, when this render method is called, it's going to return an input type of whatever type it's supposed to be, and then it's going to render its value. In this case, we made the render value method private, so it could only be called internally. If this value is empty, it's not going to do anything. It's going to return an empty string. But if this value does have some information, some data in it, it's then going to return the value attribute in HTML. I don't want to be rushing, but this is a pretty simple and basic example of a class that has a constructor, that has some fields, that has some methods. Any questions about this before we move on? In the front.
More of a tangent. I just noticed how the word function, that keyword seemed kind of useless.
So
Just like you can have public and then.
this is a comment, not a question. So our dear friend here is commenting that PHP does not have to have the word function. It could simply have render, and then we will call this language JavaScript, version 6 or 7. You, sir.
Is the difference between the function and method, is that a PHP construct or?
So the question is this concept of functions versus methods being different, is this specific to PHP? And so there are some languages that are purely functional in nature. There are some, like Java, for example, is purely object-oriented, so you don't have to worry about it. But languages like Perl would have a similar thing. In Perl, you can create different kinds of modules. I think in Python, would that be correct? Python, you could just write functions, but you don't have to write. So it's not only PHP. Although I would have to say that PHP as a community, it's not like functions are going to go away. I'm sure that'll never happen, right? But in general, things are really moving in the direction of being objects with methods and fields and components that can be shared across projects and things like that. Pop quiz or bonus question. In PHP, what will be faster to run? Code that is just functions without any classes or objects, or similar code that does the same thing that happens to be written in an object-oriented approach? Pure functions, object-oriented in PHP. Which one executes faster? Functions? Anyone disagree with that? No? You're right. The functions work faster. And the reason for that is that it takes more work for the PHP compiler to resolve all these things and build it in memory and run it. And you might think, well, if just functions are faster to execute, why bother with OOP? Let's just write some really fast functional code. OOP, I would argue, is faster for people, right? When you're building a system and it's well designed and it has the right kind of objects, this is going to save you time, it's going to save you trouble, it's going to save you the headaches that are associated with systems that are not object-oriented. Instantiating an object. when we instantiate an object from a class, we use this keyword new. So this bit of code is related to this class. So the class is defined here. We're saying right at the top of our PHP code to require that class. And we're saying that text input is a new instance of form field input. We're going to initialize it with the text type and the hello value. And we're going to create another submit input that's a new instance of our class that is of type submit with the value submit form. If we were to echo each of these objects, calling their render, both of their render methods, we're going to see some output that looks like this. Input type text, value hello. Input type submit, value submit form. Does this make sense? OK, great. The this attribute. This is a special predefined variable that is a reference to the current object. It's sort of a shorthand way of expressing this particular instance. It's used internally to refer to the fields and methods of an object. In the example that we have, the render function is able to refer to type, and then it's able to call its render value method by saying this render value and this type. And it's important because in our example, we actually have two instances of this class running or in memory at the same time. But when in text input, the value of this type is going to be text, whereas in submit input, the value of this type is going to be submit. It's pretty much the this attribute. Creating constructors. PHP has magic methods, which PHP has a lot of mysterious things. One of them is what they call magic methods. Magic methods in PHP are usually prefixed with this double underscore, which personally, I just kind of find it to be like kind of ugly when writing my PHP code, but I kind of got used to it. But this is a method that is basically a predefined method in PHP. Every class that you create is going to have this method implicitly. If you don't define it, it's just going to do nothing, but it'll sort of be there. If you do define it, this is going to be a way to provide some values to the object to initialize it when you first create it. It's used, I feel like it's a very common thing to do is to pass in some kind of values to a class when you're constructing it. There is something called dependency injection, which would be a very advanced topic, but I think it's worth mentioning. I spend a lot of time just browsing around the internet, trying to find out what's going on with programming. I remember when I heard of this thing called dependency injection, I was like, dependency injection? What the hell is that? You know, I've been programming for a long time, and I never heard of it, right? And all of a sudden, there's require.js, and there's all these different things. There's people arguing about it in Laravel, these popular PHP frameworks. We're all talking about it. And I'm like, what the hell is it, right? So I was working with this other programmer who had created this require.js system. Like all his files use dependency injection, and I had to learn it. And I asked him, what is it? And he's like, I don't really know. You know? And so I just like kept reading about it, kept looking, and then I was actually finding the answer, but the answer was so simple that I was like having a hard time believing that that's what the answer was. Dependency injection means that, let's suppose we have some kind of object, like an object that represents our database, right? And we have maybe some other, other object that's going to be a model that's going to interact with a table in our database. You can pass that object into your new object through its constructor. And when you do it that way, this the object that's receiving this dependency, it gets the dependency, but actually doesn't know like where it came from, right? So you can pass anything in. Like I could have a database, let's say a database object for MySQL, or I could have a database object for Postgres or MongoDB or whatever it is, right? So the class that's receiving that dependency won't know which one it is, right? So the code could be written in such a way that it's very loosely coupled, right? It's just going to expect that this thing comes in, and it's going to operate on it without knowing, is it MySQL, is it Postgres, or whatever it is. Anyhow, dependency injection really is just passing the dependencies in through the constructor as like arguments. Advanced, chapter 5, the advanced PHP object-oriented programming. So in this section, we're going to talk about inheritance, which is a sad topic because someone has to die, but there's some light at the end of the tunnel. There's some money. Overriding methods, access control, and scope resolution. So inheriting classes. Before we even talk about it, let's just look at this code, which is real code that does nothing, but it is real code. So we have made a class called lion. We created another class called tiger that extends lion. We created another class called liger that extends tiger, right? Are you guys familiar with this liger, this mythical creature? We've created one in our presentation today. Inheriting really just means that one class extends from another class. Whatever was defined in lion will then, in this case, be inherited by tiger. Let's look at an example. So if we have our lion class, which has a field called hasMain, which is true, and it has a method called speak, which returns roar, and we have our tiger class that has a field called hasStripes, and then we have our liger class, which extends tiger. It has its own method, isMythical, which is true, but then it redefines the speak method, it's returning vote for Pedro. So it also has its own method called aboutMe, where it's going to dump hasMain, hasStripes, and isMythical. Now, you can see that hasMain, hasStripes has not been defined in liger, but because liger extends tiger and tiger extends lion, it's going to get those attributes. So when we run, we make a new instance of this class, Gus, and we ask Gus about me. We're going to get true, 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 vote for Pedro. Any questions about inheritance? All right, I think we're doing good here. One thing about inheritance that I think is important to note is that some people consider it to be somewhat of a bad practice. And the reason for that is that it creates coupling. Let's suppose that I create a class, a base class, and then I have 20 other classes, and I extend it, right? So now we have 21 classes in total, and then I take my base class and decide to start changing some things about it, right? Whatever I change about my base class is going to be changed in all of these sort of children classes, but in a kind of a subtle way, right? When you're just looking at one of the children classes, you're not really going to know how it has suddenly changed. You'll only know when someone calls you late at night yelling at you because their website is not working. You're going to go in and find out that, oh, I extended this thing and this thing changed, and now my website is broken, and I'm stressed. So even James Gosling, who was one of the creators or the creator of the Java language, was asked, if you created the language again, what would you do differently? He pretty much said he would just get rid of that feature altogether, that it sort of creates more trouble than it's worth. So in my work, we use a framework that does use inheritance, and I would say kind of a limited way, which is maybe a safe way to do it. But when I have like full control over how I'm creating something, I almost never use it. Let's see. Overriding methods. Overriding methods, I think, is pretty straightforward. If a class extends another class, but then it redefines a method, then it's going to have its redefined method, not the original method that was defined in the parent class. Inheriting constructors and destructors. So I was telling you that the construct method is a magical method in PHP. Let's suppose we have a scenario, and I don't want to get into MVC, but I'm using this sort of base model, customer model. Does everyone know what a model is in object? A model is typically like a type of class or object that is used to deal with data. I mean, some people take a more limited or more expanded view of it, but models are typically like a part of your system that's going to deal with data. So I decided, you know what? We have this base model that wants a database object as input, but then I decided that there's going to be some more specific models, like a customer model or whatever type of other models that we have, that is going to extend. I forgot to put the keyword in there, but theoretically, it would extend from the base model. Now, when someone calls a new instance of this one, and they pass in DB and table, table in this case happens to be a field of our child object here, so that's going to be set. But this is a kind of you could do this in different languages, but the way that PHP does it syntactically, I feel, is somewhat unique to PHP. This constructor of the parent can also be called if we write parent and then this double colon and then call the construct method of the parent. And there are many cases where you extend from something, but you still want the parent's constructor to be called. Chris.
Call a different method with that same syntax.
You know, that's a good question. We'll have to try it. So Chris's question is, if it works with constructor, can you do the same thing? I tend to think that you can, but you can, yeah. So you can do it. Man, I had this trivia slide. I can't find it. Oh well. Visibility. To me, this is a much more interesting topic. One of my favorite topics in object-oriented programming, which is how are your fields and methods visible, or I'll just say visible, to the outside, right? So if we say that a method is public, we're pretty much saying that if this class gets instantiated to an object, whatever these methods are, they can be called from the outside. If we say that it's private, it can only be called from other methods of it. It cannot be called from the outside. And I remember when I was first learning this, I was like, what's the point? If you can't call it from the outside, why would you even define it? Does that make sense? Like, why would you have a method that just can't be called from the outside? And it's really like when you're organizing your code, sometimes you want to kind of create like a subroutine, like some part of your code that's very useful to your class. So you're putting in its own method, but you don't want to expose that to the outside. It only gets used internally. Protected. Protected is sort of a hybrid of public and private. Basically, it can be called by children, but it cannot be called from the outside. Is that correct? Protected can be called by children, but not from the outside? Right. Yeah. So, sorry.
I understand the point of like visibility. The various access control point is useful for modern editors or IDE, and that like when you create a bunch of public members, then the code hint will show up on the public one. So you want to set a bunch of them.
Yes. Okay. So what's your name? Timothy. So Timothy is saying that when you're using a code editor and you have instantiated some object, some code editors are so smart that they will give you hints of your public methods. And since they're public, you can call them from the outside. True. That would be another sort of helpful usage of access control. But let's take this a little bit further. APIs. Has everyone heard of this thing, API? What is an API? Does everyone? Application Programmer Interface, is that what you said? Correct. Great. What's an Application Programmer Interface?
It's like the part that's exposed to the public so that one can use it. So like the
Yes.
that you offer up.
Yes. Good answer. So an API. So let's suppose I create some classes, right? And you're going to use them, right? Now, you may look at it and you might go, oh my God, Ryan created this class for me to use to do my work, but there's 30 methods in this thing. Like, how am I going to figure this out? And then you go, wait a second. There's 30 methods, but 28 of them are private. 2 of them are public. Which ones do you need to care about? the two public ones, the only ones you could really call in your system. So this is an aspect of visibility or access control where it's sort of a form of documentation. Because yes, it's true, PHP will throw an error if you try to call one of the private methods from the outside. But furthermore, it's a way for the designer or the creator of this code to express, I don't want you to call these ones, right? And these other ones that are protected, yeah, maybe you want to extend this class and you want access to these methods, right? So it's, yes, the language enforces it, but it's also a way to understand the intent of how the person who created it expected it to be used. Using the scope resolution operator. Here it is. This is another, like, I don't think many languages have this operator, this double colon operator. Have you ever seen an error in PHP where it mentions Pamium Nekudotium, right? So this thing, I don't think it has like a name in the English language, but in Hebrew it's called Pamium Nekudotium, right? Which I believe means 2 dots twice. I might not be right about that, but I think that's what it means. This is an operator that you could use in PHP to do what's called scope resolution. Typically, it's used for calling static methods or static fields in your class. This is the last sort of topic that we talk about, but it's about static methods and static fields. So static fields are fields that when they get a value in the class, those values are, you could say, automatically visible or propagated to all of the instances of that class. So in this example, I have some variable that gets initialized to 0. It is a static variable. I have a public static function, set variable, that will take in a value and it will change this value. And then I have a public function, show variable, that's going to return whatever the variable has to be. Now, I'm saying some class. So I haven't even instantiated this class yet. I'm not operating on the object. At the class level, I'm specifying the name of the class, this funky double colon operator, and I'm saying set, this should be the method, set variable. Let's just suppose I'm calling set variable to 2. Now, when I do make some instances of this class, and I show variable, even though it had not been set in them, it had not been initialized, it had not been modified, they're all going to report 2 because that's how it was set statically in the class. That's it. I covered the topics from the 2 chapters. Thank you for being here. Check us out at BetterLesson. As I mentioned, we are hiring. This is my email, my Twitter handle, and my GitHub account. Questions? Anybody have questions? Any questions? Is it a comment or a question? Timothy, you are a habitual presentation commenter.
Okay.
Do you have a question?
Okay, I'll give you a softball one first.
A soft one. Okay. let me have it, Timothy.
So can you tell us about like your backend, your stack of BetterLesson?
Oh, he wants to know about what we're doing better. This is a great question. Very self-serving. I like that. To me. So at BetterLesson, we are using Cake PHP, which is not a super popular PHP framework, but it's one of the first PHP frameworks to really embrace MVC. I'm proud. I wasn't there when it was created, but I'm proud to say that we've used it in this company in a very smart way. So we have APIs and a very fast website that's based on Cake PHP. On the front end, we have a very efficient system using some clever JavaScript magic, and we have another API that uses Python on the back end. Recently, we have gotten into using React, which is, I'm a little frazzled today because we were learning React all day. But BetterLesson stack is a mix of PHP, Python on the back end. On the front end, it's JavaScript. And I would say that we're kind of a team that really embraces best practices. So maybe, who knows what, in a year we might be using Go or one of these other crazy languages. But whatever language we use, we want to use it in a really smart way to leverage the benefits of whatever that language might be.
So does Cake have an ORM, or do you use SQL?
So he's asking, does Cake have an ORM? Yes, Cake has an ORM. Personally, I'm not. Does everyone know what an ORM is? No. Okay, so in a database, you traditionally would write some kind of queries in a declarative language called SQL, where you say select star from friends where remembered my birthday equals true, right? And it's going to give you some friends who thought about you, right? Somewhere along the lines, some really smart people decided that, well, writing these queries is tedious. We're going to create this thing called an object relationship manager, or ORM. And this ORM would sort of, it's supposed to make it easier to, or object relational mapper, is that what it is? Something like that. It's supposed to make it easier to write queries. I would personally argue that ORMs basically make new programmers not know how to write queries, and that they're not that, ORMs are not that clever. So when you have to write a very complex query, the ORM usually falls flat on its face. It will kind of generate a query that's not optimized, so you have to write queries anyway. I remember at my last job, I had to mentor this programmer, a really smart guy, and he had a query that was not doing what it's supposed to do. So they asked me, can you help him with it? I said, yeah, no problem. So I said to him, show me your query, right? And he comes, he shows me like this object-oriented code, right? And I said, okay, show me your query, right? And he's like, well, it's here. You know, I make a new instance of this thing, and I do that. And I'm like, that's not a query, right? So we looked at the logs, and we saw the generated query, and we were able to figure it out. But I was surprised. When I started, there were no ORMs, so not that I'm really aware of, right? He started 3 years ago, and everything is about ORMs. So maybe they save some time here and there, but in the long run, they typically end up creating a slower system because you end up with a bunch of developers who can't write an optimized query. There we go for some opinions there.
Okay.
Anybody besides Timothy have a question? We'll come back to you. In the back.
I have a comment and a question.
Oh.
Comment is, I think tigers don't have names, but I think your tiger inherited a name from the lion.
Yes, yes, you're correct. All right.
That's really strange. And my question is, I think you mentioned destructors, I think? Like,
Yeah, yeah.
Constructors, but I didn't see any mention of them.
Sure, sure, sure. Fine,
I
fine.
wanted to know, like, what's a good use of,
Keep me honest. Yeah. So good question. So a destructor is kind of similar. You can kind of think that's the inverse of a constructor, right? When the instance is getting created, this constructor is always going to get called, and you can do some initialization. But what if when the object is destroyed, that you want something else to be called, right? And a use case for this, right? And this is a real, actual use case for me, because we write a lot of constructors. We don't write a lot of destructors. So a few years ago, the MongoDB driver for PHP didn't itself close the Mongo connection when the Mongo object itself was destroyed, right? I had a website going, and they were saying randomly that they would get like a blank screen, right? And I was like, oh, that's strange. You know, what's this random blank screen about? So after looking into it, I saw, oh my God, there's maybe like, in a minute, maybe 10 people go to this website. But there were like 700 database connections open to the database, because every time a visitor would come, a connection would get opened, it would never get closed. So for some window of time, there was like a wrapper that I had created to this MongoDB driver. Every time the wrapper would get destroyed, basically at the end of the PHP cycle, you can destroy manually an object that you create, but when PHP itself sort of completes, all those objects can get destroyed. So I created a destructor to close the database connection, and the problem was solved. Does that sort of answer like what a destructor is and how you might use it? They're not used that often, but sometimes you need them.
Going back to the question of whether a tiger should have a name,
Oh my goodness.
but a liger should have both stripes and name. We can have that in biology because a liger can have two parents, one a lion and one a tiger. I don't think we can do that in PHP.
Ah, no, talking about multiple inheritance
We're
here.
going to cover multiple inheritance.
Yes, 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 yes. If I think that inheritance is bad, oh, yeah, I really hate multiple inheritance. So in PHP, more recently, they created something called traits. which are kind of interesting. It's not in this chapter, but traits are sort of like classes in a sense, but you could mix them much more easily. Like I could say that this new class is going to have as a trait lion, tiger, bear, whatever sort of traits that I wanted it to have. But using purely object-oriented programming-based inheritance using the extend keyword, you can only extend one class at a time, right? So, like, let's actually go back to this. This is a pretty cool question. So, if we look at this pseudocode version, right? Wouldn't it be cool for, like, I didn't want, when I was writing this in the first place, I was like, I don't want the tiger to extend a lion, but if I want the liger to extend the lion and the tiger, then the tiger would have to extend the lion so that the liger could then extend the tiger, right? It would be cool, perhaps, if you're a fan of inheritance, that you could say something like class liger extends tiger, comma, lion, but you can't. There's not a construct that is allowed in PHP. So if you want to inherit from multiple things, you have to start organizing them into like hierarchies, which will later strangle you when you start creating impossible hierarchies and have even more cascading side effects in your code than you ever imagined possible.
The cycles get you in trouble?
It's not the cycles. It's more that, think of yourself working on some kind of project, right? You can only keep so many facts in your brain at one moment, right? So if you're looking at this class that's a full, it's not like a pseudocode class. You're looking at this full class, right? But at the top of it, it says that it extends some other class. And that class extends some other class. And that class extends some other class. What are the chances that when you're working in that class, in your mind, you're like, oh, well, it also has all these other properties from these other three things that I can't see unless I open all those files, right? You need like 4 monitors to have them all open at the same time and kind of really get a good picture of what that class is, right? So not only does it make like the changes of one class cascade into another class, but it kind of obscures the true nature of that class when you look at it because its fields and methods are spread out across many different files. Does that make sense? It's like a very fundamentalist, anti-inheritance kind of programmer.
Traits solves that, or traits is equally as bad?
I would say that for people who like really wanted to create these sort of composite objects, traits are like, hey, have fun, knock yourself out. You could have as many as you want, right? But in terms of like software architecture design, it has I would argue that it has the same effect of like, kind of like really like, well, you want to play with matches? Here's a blowtorch kind of thing, So, any other questions? Timothy, some comments?
I guess this question is for you or anyone else in the room, because you said that you didn't read the book too much in depth.
Yeah, true.
I think in chapter 6 or chapter 5 they go into design patterns, so I guess they're going to use something.
That's next month? Yeah. Yeah, probably like maybe two sessions down.
One of the problem I had when learning design pattern was like what the uses are, because like I would read these code and then they look like they're just playing around with objects and there's no purpose to it.
Okay, got it.
Does the book go into
So
why they would use these kind of things? For example, the singleton, yeah, that would be useful in some connection and so forth.
So if I can rephrase your question. So I think your question is, does the book not only tell you what some of these patterns are, but like why they're useful in the first place? And it does. It definitely does. I would kind of love to talk about it, but I think we gotta come back for that one. Shall we conclude?
Yeah, we can ask more questions in the other room if you want. So hey, nice work.
Thank you guys so much for being here.